The rest of Chapter 5 is dedicated to being able to explain how a whole range of demand and supply side factors will impact growth. So this video is a bit of an introduction to how demand more generally will impact on an economy's growth rate. So you've got your demand side conditions. Now impacts on demand are going to affect short-term or cyclical growth. And supply side conditions are all about influencing the economy's long-term productive capacity and allowing for long-term sustainable growth without inflation. So the business cycle and economic growth, when we have rising GDP leading to a boom, in the short term basically what happens is aggregate demand increases and injections will start to outweigh leakages, so injections are greater than leakages. Consumption expenditure will rise and that will stimulate aggregate demand. And if the economy is operating at or close to productive capacity, stronger aggregate demand will mean that demand outstrips national production, and this will lead to shortages and inflation. When we have falling real GDP, generally it's a sign that leakages outweigh injections. Consumption will fall, aggregate demand will fall. That will lead to a reduction in employment, because hey, if nobody wants products, there's no point in supplying them. Incomes will fall as people lose their jobs. Inflation is likely to fall because national production, basically we have lots of excess supply, we've got loose labour markets, excess capital, and this causes stocks of unsold goods. But generally when inventories are rising, it's a sign that there's a lack of demand. So if businesses have an increased level of stock or inventory, it's a sign that the aggregate demand is really slowing the economy. Ideal levels of GDP, between the peaks and the troughs, aggregate demand is exactly equal, matches the country's productive capacity, so we're kind of in that intermediate zone where I wouldn't say they quite match each other, but aggregate demand is so we're able to increase productive capacity at a rate similar to aggregate demand. That's what that means. Expenditure is not too great, causing inflation, or not too small, causing recessions. So what happens when aggregate demand increases? Well, basically, it leads to a rise in injections relative to leakages. That point's really important. Injections are higher than leakages when we have this higher growth. Firms see growing sales or large orders of stocks because there's more demand. They have falling stocks of unsold goods, so basically they're selling their stuff. Businesses respond by increasing their production. So demand increases, firms see increased orders, they're basically about to run out of stock, so they boost their production, assuming they have unemployed resources or unused productive capacity. So they have unused labour, unused capital, we'll just start using all that stuff. The fancy word for saying that. If firms respond in this manner, there's likely to be an expansion in economic activity in the short term. Okay. Eventually what will happen is if aggregate demand continues to grow, we will have no unused productive capacity, and that will lead to shortages and inflation. This process is really important. So anytime you're explaining a demand side factor, this is the process that occurs. There's more injections, firms run out of stock, firms employ more resources to increase their level of production, so they employ labour, they employ capital, so that they don't have shortages. Then that increases economic activity because we're producing more, and eventually if demand is too high we'll reach our productive capacity and have shortages and inflation. So demand side cyclical determinants of economic growth. The economic growth of Australia rises and falls in a cyclical way in the short term because of aggregate demand. Stronger demand side conditions lift production, assuming there's unused productive capacity. We sell our unsold stock and increase new orders from customers. This increases production until we reach our productive capacity. And Australia can grow at around 4%. The aggregate demand can generally grow at around 4% before we start to jeopardise domestic economic stability, before we start to see excessive inflation. Slowing aggregate demand, well, kind of the opposite things happen. We see a rise in leakages relative to injections. Firms notice that their sales will start to fall. There's an absence of orders, basically. No one's demanding their stuff. Businesses will cut their output because, hey, if no one's buying it, why are we going to supply it? Firms do this as firms stop producing. There's a slowdown in economic activity. So unemployment starts to rise because producers aren't demanding labour as much, and this can lead to a recession or a depression. Slowdown causes higher unemployment, lower inflation, and lower prices. So that's sort of the process that occurs. Okay, there's too many leakages, people are saving too much, there's not enough demand, there's an absence of orders in the economy, businesses cut production because there's no point in producing. This leads to a lack of demand for labour and capital resources, can lead to a depression or recession, and leads to lower employment and lower inflation or higher unemployment. And then you've got your ideal conditions where aggregate demand is neither excessive, causing an inflation, or insufficient, causing unemployment. Governments try and use their policies to try and stabilise and keep aggregate demand at this kind of level so that it's not too high or not too low. It's just right. like the what is it, the little bear's food. Good example. Just a study hint from the text. Whenever a factor causes aggregate demand to change, so whenever there's a shift in aggregate demand, so bang, bang, it will have an indirect effect on aggregate supply via a change in aggregate price levels. So higher prices will be caused by a shift in demand to the right. Whenever demand goes to the right, we have higher prices, and that's going to lead to an increase in supply because businesses will have the incentive to produce because of the higher price. So any change in demand will impact supply, but it's like an expansion in supply. Other factors that shift the aggregate demand will have long-term supply side effects. So there will be certain things, though, that, like investment spending, it's a little bit different. So consumption, if consumer confidence goes up, aggregate demand shifts to the right, supply will increase because of the higher prices, we'll have an expansion in supply, but it's only a demand side factor. But something like increased investment spending, well, that's going to shift the demand curve to the right as well. But in the long term, the productive capacity will increase because we've now invested in better technology and better infrastructure. So factors that will boost investment spending, like lower business taxes because they'll have more profits, or tax concessions to invest so they don't have to pay as much tax, that's going to lead to a demand curve shifting to the right in the short term, but in the long term it will boost our aggregate supply curve and increase our productive capacity. So with increased consumer confidence, the supply curve doesn't shift, it will just move along with the supply curve. But increased business confidence or increased investment spending might actually shift the supply curve in the long term. But for this course, we focus mainly on the demand side impact. When we're talking about supply side effects, so whenever the supply curve shifts, like for example if it was to shift to the right, that will lead to increased aggregate demand as well, an expansion in aggregate demand because of the lower prices. Remember, an expansion is always a movement to the right. Don't get put off by the fact that is sort of going down. Expansion means moving to the right, higher demand because of lower prices. So whenever you shift focusing on supply, there will be a change in aggregate demand, but not a shift, not a movement along the curve. So you need to think about where the change in economic activity actually started. These are the things that we're going to be discussing over the next few videos. Demand side factors first, and then some supply side factors. And you can see there are certain things there that belong to both sides because they're both demand and supply side factors. Okay, these are the things, this graph will be critically important.